What I find kind of surprising in all this is there is a big display in the WFAA lobby, a history of Channel 8 that went up shortly after Tracy left, I believe, and there's not one picture of you there.
I was there for 25 years, more #1 ratings than any single anchor along the way.
Yeah, I think, I remember pointing that out in the story I wrote about you. I think that may have been the beginning of the end of writing about local TV in the market, but anyway. So you missed a chance to unseat Mike Snyder, but you go to Channel 11, and I know you had very high hopes, and clearly 11's newscast is, well, it's gotten better over the years, then not so good, then better, then not so good, then kind of terrible for about a 5-month period, and now seems to be back on the upswing. But can you talk a bit about just the importance of, you worked for Marty Haig for a long time. You had that continuity there. I think you've had about a half dozen news directors at Channel 11. Each one brings his or her own philosophy or is told what philosophy to bring. How difficult is that when you're trying to get a consistent newscast on the air, to have a new vision every 18 months or so?
Well, it's really difficult, and you got to remember that when I went over to Channel 11, there were, promises made, gifts exchanged, and, I had asked all the right questions, and I was given all these guarantees, and I took the title of managing editor, and for a while I was able to have some real impact on our copy. But, and I think I told you this, Ed, but it was really like stepping down 50 markets, because Channel 11 just really had a very poor effort at trying to put together a credible newscast. They'd hired some good people, most of them young, most of them gone now, and but they really weren't in the same ballpark as the folks who've been players for a while, not 4, 5, or 8, and they were just perplexed. They didn't know what to do, and so I was supposed to have this sort of guiding hand. And the first thing that happened was when CBS then came in. You got to remember that I was actually, I was hired by CBS. The people who were in charge of the Channel 11 newsroom were hired by the Gaylord folks they were in the process of selling Channel 11 to CBS. So the first thing that CBS did when they came in was fire these people who had been the people with whom I'd been negotiating for the most part. So things began to change almost immediately. And it was very difficult. We have had at least 6 news directors, 2 general managers, and 3 or 4 creative services people, or the people to project your image out in the marketplace. We could never get consistent. I believed then, and I believe now, that the station that will ultimately percolate to the top again in this market and have real dominance will be the station that understands that news is, in and of itself, interesting, and you don't have to try to create news or pander to a certain part of the public. If you hire good people and give them an opportunity to tell good stories, I think the public will buy into that. Yeah.
I guess in some ways working at cross purposes to that is, and you mentioned earlier, the pursuit of the demographic. When you first started out, it wasn't who watched, just how many people are watching our newscast, and whatever the rating is, didn't matter if they were men, women, dogs, as long as people were in front of the set. Now, it obviously matters a great deal. I think, in fairness to all the stations, are looking, I guess, to hit the women 25-54 demo. Women watch late night newscasts in considerably larger numbers than men. It's interesting when you look at the Nielsen's, roughly about 100,000 more women on a typical night watch one of the 4 10 o'clocks than men, 25-54. So it would make, I guess, some sense to try to appeal that audience, but there are ways of doing that. It seems the way that most stations do it is with youth creams, cellulite, and whatever. How do you feel about that? And I think 11 has started kind of doing some of that now again, even under Regent Dukas. Well, he didn't know how to pander to women, I guess, and didn't have enough time. But how destructive can that be to a newscast? You have to have a balance, I guess, and you want to have stories that maybe appeal to the largest group watching you, but you don't want to pander.
Well, I think, Ed, that you need to back up and just consider for a moment what's happening to television news across the country. The networks are losing, what is it, 1 million viewers a year, I think, on average now on their nightly newscasts, something like that. You got to remember that when I first came into this market, we had essentially 3 stations doing news. And you didn't have a lot of channels to choose from. You only had a half dozen channels or so, and so obviously you would have a captive audience. And in those days, people would watch the newscast before they'd go to bed, whatever newscast they happened to be watching. And I think that what's happened is that as that audience aged, as I've aged, and you've aged, and so many of us in this room have, we still watch television news perhaps, or would watch TV news if it were worth watching, but we have chased those viewers away. We've taken a broom and we've said to you, you're too old, we don't want you watching our news product, we want to pander to a younger audience. These are called vanity pieces that you're talking about now. And it's a consultant-driven newscast, and where news directors used to be journalists, people like Marty Haig and John Miller and others were journalists first. Now they're consultants first, and they work with all of these consulting agencies, Maggot being maybe the most infamous, but they work with these folks on a regular basis. They meet with them, and the consultants for these consultant companies like Maggot will say, well, here's what you need to do. And general managers who know very little about journalism, but an awful lot about the business side of TV, say, okay, well, that's what we're going to do now. So the news director, instead of sort of setting a news agenda, sets an agenda that's based on what the consultant says will work to attract this audience. And so that's where these vanity pieces come from. And you know, it used to be that we would hold up, we used to say this in speeches, you know, we hold up the mirror to the public and we just simply reflect what you're doing. That's not as true anymore. You know, we are a little more responsible for what's going through the pipeline. And we're not exactly showing our community as it is, but rather as the consultants say people want it to be. Now, what about crime news? Well, if you look, our crime statistics, and we've had a terrible crime record in Dallas for a long time, but our statistics are actually going down, or less crime now than there used to be. But you wouldn't know that by watching TV news, because crime is easy, and I think consultants say, well, it's titillating and people want this. I'm not sure of that. I don't think they do, not to this.
And I guess too, and I know for a while during the previous news director's time, I think you had spoken kind of openly about the brand. It kind of cheapened because the kind of news you were doing then, almost wall-to-wall crime and tragedy, some advertisers didn't want to be associated with that either, let alone viewers maybe.
No, and Regent Dukas, who was here for 5 months, was without exception, I've been in business a long time, the worst news director I ever knew. He had no educational or formal training, not that you necessarily have to have a degree, but I think you do need to know something about the discipline. You have to know something about how to generate and how to research and how to put stories together and so forth. He spent most of his time as a sports producer, and then just sort of matriculated as an assistant news director into a really bad news department in Detroit. And he was just sort of sucked up, went off to Kansas City to be a news director, and that's the only place that he'd been a news director before he came here. And I mean, it was crime all the time. And then there was a hope that we would be able to, you know, somehow jack up the ratings here, and they brought him in and put him to work, and all he knew was he was a one-trick pony, and he didn't know how to do anything except crime news in a small market way. So it really made us look bad, and I think it drove viewers away, and it drove advertisers away. Hell, it drove me away, and it drove people inside the business away, I think. It drove you away. You know, nobody wanted to watch it. None of us.
And you did leave at 10 o'clock just in time, so you didn't have to decide over that. But let's talk about, I know at that time you had planned to retire in July of this year. You recently decided to re-up for 2 more years, and you're going to be doing a combination of things, anchoring the 5 o'clock, and can you tell people some of what you're going to be doing at Channel 11? And I guess in some ways it's a dream come true if it all works out the way it's laid out on paper to you.
Well, after all of the criticism that I've handed down, you know, let me just say that Channel 11 has been very good to me in a lot of ways, and I am very fond of our general manager. We're friends. Steve Malden, I think, while he is a businessman and he is trying to do his best to make certain that CBS gets its money's worth, at the same time I think he does see where we should be applying ourselves in certain areas. So he has asked me to be able to sort of lead that effort, which will be a good thing for me. I can tell my own stories and be sort of my own boss. I'll do the 5 o'clock news, but they're going to give me plenty of time to travel and go out and do stories. In fact, we're going to go on a short trip starting tomorrow. And I'm excited about this. They're not going to count hours on me. One day I might work, you know, 3 or 4 hours, and then maybe the next day I work 12, but I won't be punching a clock. I'll simply be pursuing the stories where they take us. So I hope that even as we're doing vanity pieces and crime stories and so forth, we'll be able to add a few other stories, maybe the look of things as I think they should be, but also as I think the market we'll see if the market will respond to it. We've started doing this. I'm doing a perspective now on Sundays, and which is a commentary and a news piece, but you know, we went off to Oklahoma and covered this David Bourne sponsored thing where they brought in the politicians. We heard that one, I guess, a week ago on Monday, but it was a somewhat different kind of thing than what we've been doing. And I'll play an important role maybe as we, so I've been told, as we get into the elections. Well, it's a 2-year deal. It's really 2 one-year deals. So at the end of the first year, if I decide that I really don't want to do this anymore, I'll step back. And I'm in kind of, in a lot of ways, an enviable place in my career. Obviously, my career is winding down, but I'll be able to do some things that, you know, will be fun to do. And if I want to step away from it, I'll still be able to do that.